Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have with us Nia Johnson, who's a visiting assistant professor of law at Duke Law School. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's with us, who's the Associate Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our conversations today. You know, there's an interesting topic that I thought we could talk about. In Kansas, we see a situation where Governor Laura Kelly signed into place a new bill that basically is allowing 15-year-olds with restricted license to be able to drive to church or other religious activities. It was previously passed in the House, and it basically passed substantially by 87-30. And when it actually got to the Senate, it passed unanimously 38-0. Lawmakers ended up rewriting all of their statutes so they could entitle 15-year-olds to be able to actually go to religious activities, drive themselves there anytime between the time frame of 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. You know, when I hear this kind of case and when I look at this type of situation and you realize that there are certain things in certain parts of the world, like, for example, you have individuals who would be of this age that would be working on farms and things of that nature. But it concerns me when we start centering out and pulling out religious activities and religion and church and that type of thing as it relates to something that's really very secular. You know, Nia, am I just being too crazy about this? Or is this something that makes sense that we ought to really be cautious in how we go about this?
No, I think we absolutely should be cautious about this. I mean, again, you know, when we talk about religious freedom, we're not just protecting the right to be religious and to practice your religion, but also the ability to be a-religious. And so it also is very concerning. You know, you have populations of 15-year-olds that are agnostic, that are atheists, that, you know, may be still trying to figure out what they believe. And so the idea that one group of 15-year-olds are allowed to go out on a Saturday night and drive themselves there and another group would not, you know, it brings many things into question. But I also think that a lot of this law is about a broader conversation that I think many individuals in the United States are feeling about a loss of Christian culture. And how do we make these broad statements that say that, like, Judeo-Christian culture still exists and we want our young people to understand this and to be very tapped into it. And so that's when you have state legislatures making some of these type of laws that are looking like, oh, well, we're just doing things that are inherently moral, when in ways you're actually excluding large groups of people.
You know, Bettina, it sounds like this is really a question of, are we trying to create a new, you know, moral majority of Christianity and therefore allowing 15-year-olds to be able to drive to church or religious activities? And that even begs the question, what exactly is a religious activity that you're allowed to go to? You know, this seems like it's gone way too far, and it creates issues for those who are really wanting to fight for religious freedom down the road when you start to see it's kind of being used, in my opinion, in a very haphazard way.
Well, Olin, I need to preface my comments with the fact that I have a teenager in the house who is currently learning to drive, and that colours entirely my perspective of this discussion because I don't think it's safe for any 15-year-old to be let loose on the roads unsupervised. But, you know, you're right, Olin. This creates a perception that religion is being privileged in some meaningful way. It seems to be promoting the idea of, you know, we need to regain our religious culture. We need to affirm the values that make us who we are as Americans. Of course, the law itself references only religion. So theoretically, you could have Muslim students or Sikh students driving themselves to religious activities as well. However, I think demographically that's probably less likely than Judeo-Christian believers driving themselves to places. But all in your point as to why distinguish religion specifically is a good one, because you have here a situation where a 15-year-old can drive themselves to school, to a church-sponsored Bible study, but they can't drive themselves to a secular club meeting, like, an honors society meeting. And for me, simply on the level of optics, on PR, this is a red flag. It feeds into the narrative that religious folk these days are entitled, and they're trying to use the law to plant the Christian flag for the American nation.
Lawrence, I've got to throw this out to you, and almost red flag, red state, planting flags. Have we gone a little bit too far here? Or does this concern some of us who want to be going out and fighting for religious freedom for somebody to come back and say, look at what you guys are doing over here?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. Having done this for a long time, things like this do make me a little nervous. I remember preparing to advocate for one of our church members who was a faithful church member and was having a hard time. The employer did not want to give them Sabbath off, even though it was entirely within their purview to do so. And the employer wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. And I say that because he went on Facebook and apparently didn't realize that the employee he was talking about somehow had access to his Facebook page. And in his post to a friend, the employer is going on and on about how, all this religious accommodation stuff, I need to make whatever I want to do a matter of religion. And he just went on and, actually said, maybe I need to become a Seventh-day Adventist. But as I listened to the sarcasm in his post, because the church member actually forwarded it to me, as I listened to the sarcasm in his post, I realized that for many people, there's a real disconnect when you try to make an argument as to why something should be allowed, and the basis for that argument is religion. I mean, perhaps the message they were trying to send was, young people, if your mother and dad won't get you to church on time, we're going to let you drive yourself. Well, as well-meaning and as good intention as all that may be, unless there's some study that shows that a trip to church magically puts our teenagers in a place where they are protected in a way that they won't be protected if they're driving, to a school event, you have to wonder about wanting to go this way. And at the end of the day, as one of my colleagues said, perhaps you just need to tell all 15-year-olds, have at it and let's hope for the best.
Jennifer, it just feels like this is one of those times where, obviously we have a Senate here that voted 38-0 for this to go forward. So obviously this is something they feel comfortable with their constituency. But on the broader picture, the idea of saying that if you are going to a religious activity as a 15-year-old, you could drive. But if you're going to maybe a non-religious activity as a 15-year-old, you can't drive yourself. I mean, that in and of itself has to juxtapose a problem. And I can't even imagine where this would go if we ended up in the federal courts with this.
Well, and I want to take a step back. Not all religious activities are covered here, because the way that the law is defined, it defines a religious organization as one that has a place of worship and meets at least once a week. And so I can imagine that there are some religious groups that don't meet this definition. Again, this is very much geared towards Judeo-Christian faith. And so we're singling out, I think, Christianity here is getting this benefit, because not all people of faith, of all faiths, will be protected by this law. Not all 15-year-olds can go to all religious activities under this. It's really protecting Christian 15-year-olds to go to these activities.
Well, let me push a little bit further on that, Jennifer. Is this really creating almost a feeling of an entitlement, which is really where you have the other side of this argument will always say, why does this group always feel that they're entitled? Does this really push and create even more of an entitlement argument when you see this?
I think definitely. And I think it's a disservice to Christians, right? Because it does look as if we're looking for privileged status here, and society is not going to look kindly on that. So I don't know that this is really furthering the goal of preaching Christ and ministering to our neighbors that may not be of the same belief and faith.
But Tina, what's even a little bit more troubling is when you start to look at the definition of what is a religious organization. And one of the things that we're starting to see in our society is all individuals can now start almost creating their own religion. We meet once a week. So if the group of us decided to meet once a week and call ourselves the Church of Orland, am I going to be in a good situation here? Or is this really trying to put us in a position where we are really trying to move forward something positive in society without creating this entitlement that usually has the biggest, pushback from the rest of society.
And you've put your finger on the key problem here, Orlin, because when religious groups push for these sort of expansive religious freedom rights, they dilute the power of legitimate religious exemptions that are needed, that are necessary. Because I don't want our conversation here to be interpreted by anyone watching to mean that I don't support religious exemptions in many situations, because they are absolutely vital for religious institutions, for schools, and for other entities, for them to preserve their religious identity, to express their religious belief. They're all part of that communal aspect of religious freedom. So religious exemptions from generally applicable laws are necessary, but let's not cheapen them with laws such as this, which serve only to create animosity and to really fuel the bad feeling that is already being directed toward religious exemptions from general laws.
Nia, I think we see the way Bettina really hit this is talking about cheapening the law. As you're somebody who's instructing in the area of law on a regular basis, one of the things I always remembered from law school was the idea that there was supposed to be this certain amount of strength of the law and never create something that would cheapen it. I mean, have you seen something similar even in what you see on a regular basis?
Well, I think there's definitely a conversation about privileging of Christian individuals and why they believe that they should have the ultimate say on how religious culture works in the United States. And I think some of that may have to do with, with this being a religious group that also has a vigor for evangelism and this idea that there's supposed to be a far-reaching hand. However, I do think it's really important to remember, and I want to piggyback off something that Lauren said, which is that, churches also aren't necessarily the safest spaces either. And, as a scholar, we also need to think about the research and the data that's out there about what's fostered in religious spaces. We know that religious spaces generally encourage a lower level of empathy. There have been a number of surveys that have put this out there in the world that have said that, when you're a part of a religious group that believes that there's one singular way to achieve something, it generally decreases empathy. So we're not necessarily sending 15-year-olds to the most empathetic places. We also have seen religiosity as a risk factor for domestic violence. And so even then, we may not necessarily be sending 15-year-olds to the safest places. And so even in being willing to have a holistic view of what religiosity promotes and seeing how that was just co-opted into the law without there being a real understanding of what comes with religious spaces and this assumption that automatically it's a safe place to be, it can be ultimately misguided. And I think we owe it to, in the spirit of religious liberty and welcoming many different groups and views and ideas, actually being transparent about what is a religious space and how helpful or not harmful is it actually?
Well, I think the point you're raising there, and I'll give you the last word on that, Nia, is that we have to be cautious in ensuring that as we're putting laws in place, that they're cutting across both sides. We see that there are a number of rules and regulations that churches are now having to follow in terms of protecting individuals, protecting our youth. And these are laws that have come down from the federal side. So I think as we look forward in how these occupations and how these decisions are being made, making sure that at the end of the day, we're not trying to be overly entitled. We're just simply trying to make sure that our religious beliefs are going to be protected. One of the landmark decisions that we have been talking about from time to time is really the Burwell versus Hobby Lobby situation. This was a very, very interesting case, which really was a seminal case that started to talk about the idea of a corporation being viewed as an individual in which the religious beliefs of the individuals who were at the top of this organization wanted to go to court to basically say there's certain things that we would not want to make available to our employees from a healthcare perspective as it related to termination of pregnancies. The Supreme Court ended up hearing this case, and there was a 5-4 decision in the majority that ended up ruling for Hobby Lobby. It's one of those decisions that we are now seeing a lot of issues that are coming up on a state basis, really from a case-by-case standpoint. But I think in order to really understand where we're going with some of these cases that we may even see before the Supreme Court in the upcoming sessions is to really understand where exactly this whole process began. Jennifer, can you tell us a little bit about this whole concept as it related to Hobby Lobby and what the overall thought process was and why it's turned out to be the seminal case that it is today?
Sure. And, this is really dealing with the application of the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act and whether it applies to corporations or only individuals. And I think what's to me interesting here is the concept of a corporation having or claiming a religious belief. The court looked at it from the standpoint of, well, we shouldn't be treating this closely held for-profit as different than a nonprofit, and they kind of parsed it that way. But to me, I do think that there are some differences. If I'm going to work for Hobby Lobby, I'm going to work for a corporation that is, providing crafts and, things for hobbies. I'm not really going there to work because I believe in the same things as the owners of the corporation per se, versus, a nonprofit, there is a mission and employees oftentimes will go there because they also believe in the mission. So, this idea of a for-profit corporation having a religious belief, I think that's what kind of is unsettling to me about this particular decision.
Well, Bettina, when we look at this and we talk about being a closely held corporation, which by definition means that the ownership is not public, it's a small number of individuals that you can probably point to them pretty easily. If that group decides that, this is something that's against my religious beliefs, and they decide that I am probably considered to be the corporation as an individual because of a corporate law and structure, was it going too far? Or does it make sense that that should be taken into consideration?
Right. So the argument that is made by people who would support the Hobby Lobby case or the outcome there is that you do not relinquish your religious freedom rights when you decide to open a for-profit company. And so that is the line of thinking that informs their argument. And, that we're still seeing that idea debated. I mean, we just recently had an oral argument in the 303 Creative case, which is looking at a religious or a Christian website designer who does not want to design websites for same-sex marriages. And so we're still, the courts are still grappling with that key idea and how to draw those lines. But for me, Orlan, the significance of this case is more than just the legal issues involved, because more than any other case in recent years, Hobby Lobby fundamentally changed how religious freedom and religious freedom rights are perceived in this country. I mean, RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it went from this bipartisan idea, this unified concept of religious freedom is worth protecting. Following Hobby Lobby, RFRA came to be seen as this sort of powerful club that people of faith can just use at will to, squash any other legal right or legal obligation that they don't like. And that is actually a false perception, because in reality, RFRA cases claims fail at least more than 50% of the time.
Yep.
So RFRA and religious freedom has been profoundly shaped, the conversation around it, by this case. And for me, that is a tragedy of Hobby Lobby.
Nia, I got to ask you, as somebody who is in a law school setting, whenever you hear about seminal law being created and the conversations that will happen now from a scholarship standpoint and even in communication with students, where do you see Hobby Lobby and how it can actually be, interjected or even sliced up to some degree from an analysis standpoint with individuals in the legal profession?
Well, when I'm working with my students, one thing that I try to encourage them to do is to look at the nuance of the situation. And I think, what's really interesting about the Hobby Lobby case, outside of the wonderful points that were made earlier by Jennifer and Bettina, is that, in many communities in the United States, and it also is not an accident that it does overlap with many marginalized communities, institutions like Hobby Lobby are the only employers in a region, in a small town, in a small community. We've seen some of these challenges with organizations like Walmart. There are places where that is the only avenue of employment for many different people. And so when you make these wide-ranging, swaths in the name of religious freedom or what you believe are your moral and ethical beliefs, it then begs the question, then are you literally disenfranchising an entire community of people? The reason why, issues of contraception and abortive agents are so important is because pregnancy is actually a very dangerous thing to go through with, especially if you are a person of color in the United States. There's a myriad of literature and data that have supported this for a very long time. A lot of it is dependent on the type of healthcare resources that you have in your individual community, which again, many marginalized people tend not to have. And so even to push people into a space where contraception is not an option for them, you're actually pushing them into a space that could be more dangerous and actually creating rippled economic effects in specific communities in ways that we may not think about if you live in a coastal city where there's a large, different range of places to be employed. And I think that's important to remember.
Lawrence, in a big city like New York, where you've got so many different viewpoints and thought processes and stores and places where people work, as you look at the Hobby Lobby decision and the impact of entities being treated like persons, how do you see this decision? This is a seminal case that everyone is basically launching off of right now. And many of the things, even including the 303 creative case that Bettina just mentioned, is probably going to be looking to this. How do we look at this case and figuring out where we end up going in our society?
Well, here's the biggest problem, or at least as I see it, the biggest problem with moving like this. Religious freedom is supposed to be about what I believe and how it impacts me. And a lot of what we're seeing now is the expansion of this thought to what I believe and how it affects you. Now, I don't know what's happening in other parts of the country, but here in New York today, it's raining. And guess what? When I look out my window, it's raining on everybody, not just the people that go to church, not just the people that believe a certain way. In fact, the Bible says God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. And what that says to me is I am going too far if I am now saying, if you depart from something that I hold dear, you will be denied things that you legitimately have a right to. And that's problematic. It is okay if you want to share how you feel or how you believe, but we need to draw the line at denying benefits to people simply because they believe other than we do. And as Jennifer so correctly pointed out earlier, you go to Hobby Lobby to buy crafts, glue, glitter, and what have you. And that is the essence of a non-religious function. And so for somebody to say, well, listen, I don't believe this, and so I'm not going to allow the people that work for me to have access to these things, it sends out a message that even God and the Bible do not send out.
I got to ask you this question. When we get to a point now where we start saying to ourselves, maybe as a public company, if I can go and get a vote by my shareholders to demonstrate that the majority of them believe a certain way, is it unreal that we could get to a point where you could have IBM deciding to move forward with this, depending on what their shareholders think from a standpoint?
I mean, I think that would be an unfortunate thing, and I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. But again, I want to go back to this thing of, the court said the way that the Affordable Care Act treated contraception for these closely held corporations was not the least restrictive way of ensuring access to contraceptives, comparing it to religious nonprofits. And I just want to go back, a craft, a craft store that is for profit is not the same as a religious organization. People who work for a religious organization are usually affiliated with that organization, are in line with the beliefs of the organization. And that's just not the case for someone who's getting maybe a minimum wage job at a large corporation like Hobby Lobby.
The other interesting thing about this, Bettina, is most of these individuals that were impacted by that case, when they first started working for Hobby Lobby, there was no question whether or not they thought they would be getting the types of healthcare protection that everybody else would be getting from someplace else. And it seems as though once they got in there, the rug is pulled out. So I'm wondering now, I guess there's certain employers that you could work for with closed corporations that may have to actually advise you up front, or do you find out when it's all said and done? I mean, this seems like some of the issues that get created like this.
Yeah, you're right, because it does open a can of worms. And yes, maybe having a warning during the onboarding process for employees may be a good thing. But, I don't think we should even get to that point, because I think what we have all been talking about here comes back to a pretty basic idea, which was beautifully put by Lawrence earlier. And that is, it's a misconception to believe that religious freedom means that your idea of morality, your idea of what's right and wrong should be reflected in the laws of the land. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what religious freedom is. Religious freedom is a precious right that we must guard and protect. It's a foundational pillar of our society. And I think trying to expand it beyond what it should be just makes it more diluted and less easy to defend.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but I think, Bettina, you put it right where it needed to be. Religious freedom is precious and should be treated as a shield and not as a sword that's actually going out to harm other individuals. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, so we talked about driving in the first segment. And did you know that there is actually a national scenic byway called the Religious Freedom Byway? And it is in southern Maryland, and it takes in the city of St. Mary's, which is one of the first places where religious freedom was legislated in this country or on this continent. And it was the Act of Toleration back in 1649, I believe. So, yes, we have a highway dedicated to religious freedom.
Wow, didn't know that. Nia Johnson, tell me something I don't know.
So something that you may not know is that, unfortunately, in the United States, the approval for the Supreme Court of the United States is at 40%, which is really one of the lowest drops that we've seen in history.
Wow. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Well, in a nod to our first segment, a state reported that in a recent year, over 17,000 teenagers were involved in car accidents. And that makes me think of the bumper sticker that says, if you don't like my driving, stay off the sidewalk.
Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So since we were just talking about a RFRA case, I don't know if you are aware that the Ninth Circuit recently decided to rehear the Apache Stronghold case against the United States to save their sacred site of Oak Flat. So
Wow.
We'll see how that goes.
Wow. Well, listen, it was great having you guys here. That was some information that I'm definitely going to have to take with me someplace else. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith in politics. See you next time.